Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Andy Ricketts. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. And this week we'll be marking Volunteers Week by considering some of the challenges and opportunities facing the volunteering world at the moment. And later in Charity Changed My Life, we'll hear how the Longford Trust helped one young person turn his life around after a stint in prison.
But let's get straight on with our main feature this week. This year marks the 40th edition of Volunteers Week, which, if you're listening to this episode soon after its release, is just about to get underway. Now, we've covered volunteering quite a bit on this podcast in recent months. Most recently, we dedicated an episode to effective volunteer management and also considered how opportunities can be better tailored to the next generation of younger volunteers. We've also acknowledged the big challenges facing the sector, with a big dip in volunteer numbers since COVID. But there are also areas for growth, with a 5-fold increase in employers organising volunteering opportunities for their staff over the past 5 years. And today we'll be finding out about the situation for volunteering in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And we're delighted to have two guests joining us from those respective nations. First up, joining us from Belfast is Denise Hayward, the Chief Executive of Volunteer Now, which promotes and supports volunteering across Northern Ireland. Hi, Denise.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
And joining us from Stirling is Margaret Starkie, the Partnerships and Communications Manager at Volunteer Scotland, which works to stimulate an environment where everyone in Scotland can volunteer more often. Hello, Margaret. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I'm going to ask you both the same question just to get us started. How is volunteering and the situation for volunteers and organisations trying to attract volunteers in Scotland and Northern Ireland? Denise, perhaps if we could start with you.
Yes, thanks. So I think it's an improving picture, but definitely has been a stretching and challenging time. So if you look at the Northern Ireland statistics for volunteers, you can see that before COVID, on average, 28% of our population volunteered on a regular basis. Post-COVID, the first stats that we had showed that 17% of the population was regularly volunteering, which you can see is an over 10% drop, which is a big change. It's very difficult even to move that number by 1%. So to move it by that sort of overall number is substantial. Last year, then we saw that go back up to 21%. So we are seeing a slightly upward trajectory again, and with new people coming forward to volunteering. But it has been a very challenging time. I think our local organisations, some of them that had to really close down through COVID, were very badly affected, and they are the ones that really saw massive losses of, perhaps a whole generation, if you want to say it in that way, of older volunteers in particular. And they have been the ones that have had more to do to kind of rebuild to where they were before. So I think overall, I feel that we're in a more sort of positive place than we would have been maybe 2 years ago, but still working through the post-COVID environment and still rebuilding in many organisations.
And Margaret, maybe if you can answer the same question in regard to Scotland for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very similar to Northern Ireland as well. We produce our survey results every 2 years. It's through the Scottish Household Survey. And we've just done a recent comparison from 2019 to 2022, which has seen a decrease in adult volunteering participation by 2%. So it was previously 48%, it's now gone down to 46%. And within that, there's been a decrease mostly around, as Denise has said, around age. The older volunteers have decreased, so the overall participation for adults of ages 16 to 59 has decreased by 5%. Gender has also, during males, has decreased since 2019 to 2022 as well. So very similar, I think, across the board.
And what do you think is driving that, Margaret? I mean, are you seeing particular trends or things that are causing this to happen?
I mean, I think what we are seeing is obviously COVID has had a significant impact, and the cost of living crisis as well. We've heard people say that they can't afford to volunteer because some organisations can't afford to pay their expenses. So therefore they are out of pocket, which is what we always say, certainly through the volunteer charter. Volunteers should never be out of pocket, but organisations are really struggling. So I think it's a real combination of that. And people's interests have changed as a result of COVID. People's working patterns have changed. People have realised that they want actually more time with families as opposed to providing it to communities and things like that as well. I mean, that does sound all doom and gloom, but we are seeing increases and we are seeing other community groups and things like that coming forward. So but I think they're the main significant differences.
And you mentioned expenses and the difficulties charities are facing in reimbursing travel expenses and that sort of thing. It is a very uncertain funding environment for a lot of charitable organisations at the moment. Is there any other aspect of that funding and perhaps ability to plan years ahead as opposed to 6 months at the maximum that is affecting the relationship that charities can have with their volunteers and what they can offer them?
Certainly from a Scotland perspective, Scottish Government are on a 1-year funding pattern. We have consulted and put various different things out about fairer funding in Scotland. Our policy officer has been involved in that very heavily at Volunteer Scotland. But given current budget situations, we are on a 1-year budget cycle, and that's what a lot of charities are on as well.
And what effect does that have on the volunteers?
Well, a lot of charities are unable to function on a 1-year budget. They have to plan ahead, they have to plan years and ahead. I'm sure people are aware that redundancy policies come into effect 3 months ahead of funding, if that's an option. So it's a really hard decision for organisations, especially a lot of the smaller ones as well, that do rely on a lot of the community, a lot of local authority funding as well.
Denise, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I suppose our situation in Northern Ireland is actually slightly worse than that, depressingly enough, because of the reinstatement of the Stormont government. Currently, a lot of organisations are on 3-month letters of offer, which will expire at the end of June. And the budget situation is dire in Northern Ireland, so it's very likely that will have implications for third sector organisations. So that does create a huge degree of uncertainty. And I think that where you see that impacting is where organisations have to make choices about which posts to keep. They don't always keep the volunteering post, or what they do is they combine it with something else. So what you see is somebody whose responsibility to look after volunteers used to be a full-time post. It's now a half-time post or a bit of another post. And that does impact on organisations' ability to plan and retain volunteers. And that relationship is important. The relationship between the volunteer manager and the volunteer is sometimes what sustains that volunteering engagement. And if that chops and changes and circumstances change, it's much more difficult for the organisations to sustain, as there's lots of uncertainty around that relationship. So I think those kinds of things do impact on an organisation's ability to plan for volunteering and ability to sustain those volunteer relationships in the longer term.
So, Denise, what kind of things can the government do to help charities in their volunteering situations? I mean, I'm presuming you're going to talk a little bit about longer term funding, for example, but there are other things as well that can be done.
Yes, so through the Joint Forum in Northern Ireland, which is the Government Voluntary Community Sector Partnership, which I'm chairing at the moment, we have been working on a series of fair funding principles, which are actually hoping to be signed off now in the next few weeks. But they're asking for quite basic things, that sort of longer term commitment, that clear full cost recovery, good communication about change, all of the kind of things that probably in lots of other walks of life you kind of take for granted, but actually have become almost not available to third sector organisations in some spaces, and that's really not acceptable. And I think if government does want to work in partnership with the sector and sees huge advantages in doing so, then I think we have to see a little bit more commitment. And I think in terms of organisation skills development, I do think there's something as well about prioritising the skill around volunteer management, because if you think about the choppy waters that we've been through and the environment that we're in, managing volunteers has become a more important skill set, I would argue, for organisations, because if you've had a situation where people now are perhaps giving time and they want to give time more flexibly, and you're having to manage perhaps a bigger group of volunteers to get the same output in terms of time, the skill set around doing that is more important than it would have been pre-COVID, I would argue. And I think organisations need to be prioritising that. And in order to do that, there needs to be funding available for that to happen, either from government or from private funding organisations.
And what about the situation in Scotland, Margaret? What would you like to see from either the UK government or the devolved government in Scotland that would help charities in their volunteering efforts?
Again, we've been pushing recently for multi-year funding. So, again, similar to Northern Ireland. But again, given political situations and changes in leadership in Scotland and things like that as well. So it's very similar in that respect. And We just keep trying to work with MSPs. We've got a cross-party group in volunteering that we are secretariat for, and they're continually trying to lobby for multi-year funding. And we're trying to work with local authorities, and we're trying to work with local charities. We have a third sector interface network, which there's a volunteer centre in each local authority as well. So again, just working with those to try and increase that awareness and need and the presence that volunteers and the services that volunteers actually provide, with gaps in public services as well. So it's really just trying to influence those at the top as much as we possibly can.
So you've both given lots of great suggestions in how government can better support the volunteering world and changes that can be made. But thinking about making the most of the situation that we're currently in, you both noted that older volunteers are decreasing in number. I think that was precipitated by the pandemic and people reevaluating what they wanted to be doing with their time. Hopefully that means that younger volunteers are going to step up, come to the fore, and charities should be doing everything that they can to stimulate numbers of that demographic. I wondered if either of you have seen any challenges that are distinct to this new type of volunteer, probably younger ones. People who might not in the past have formed the core volunteer base of a charity. Anything different in terms of how the charity manages them, interacts with them, encourages them, attracts them?
So one of the things we have noticed about this new group coming forward, I think, is that the flexible word comes into play. Everybody talks about greater flexibility. And sometimes I do wonder about that, because I think if you're inside an organisation, flexibility is often extended to volunteers. So people who get to know an organisation do get to flex and change their roles. But sometimes perhaps from the outside, it can seem as though that flexibility is not available. So I think organisations do need to be better at communicating that they do allow greater flexibility for volunteering. I think one of the things I would observe is I was speaking to an organisation locally recently who has now returned to their pre-pandemic volunteering numbers after a significant fall. But what they have said is their overall volunteer time is down, because although there's the same number of people now volunteering, people are giving fewer hours. And so I think that challenge around having to manage bigger numbers of people to get the same output is a challenge for organisations, and that organisations need to be gearing up for. So they may need to do more to get to the same place that they were in prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, actually increasing their workload because you're dealing with more people fulfilling the same volunteer roles.
Exactly.
And so perhaps their perception around volunteering is different to that of older generations of volunteers.
Yes, I do think we've seen that as well. The newer generation are very cause driven, and they really want to make a massive difference. And that's brilliant. And lots of opportunities allow that to happen. But there are also some quite ordinary things that need to be done, that charities need doing. And maybe they're not as stimulating and not as interesting as volunteer roles, potentially, as some of the other more appealing things. So again, I think it's back to organisations thinking about who they're trying to attract and positioning the roles that they have in order to make sure that there's something in it for everybody and that they're getting the new people to come forward.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a young person in Scotland survey, and there was some of the highlights there with young volunteers saying that they'd never thought about volunteering as an opportunity. They had never, if they had thought about it, they would like to do it with a friend, or they would like to just come along and see if it's a fit for them instead of putting in a formal application to volunteer and it's being seen as something very formal. So these are the kind of information that we're looking at and trying to work with organisations, as Denise said, let organisations understand is a need for flexibility, rethinking those volunteer roles that meets the needs of the organisations and the charities, but understanding that, the landscape has changed in terms of what people are looking for from a volunteer opportunity, especially around young people. They want to try and fit it in. A lot of young people will try and do some volunteering opportunities because it's good for their university application and various different things like that as well. But it's about making sure volunteering is sustainable from a young age throughout all generations. And that's one of the things that we are trying to do in Scotland through a national recruitment campaign, is work with organisations to understand how they can change the mindset of different generations through the types of opportunities and the requirements of those opportunities that they need.
And on that requirements and nature of the opportunities that charities are offering, are you seeing a reduced appetite for responsibility in the roles that people are willing to take on?
Yes, we're definitely seeing that. We're hearing that time and again, that people just don't want to take responsibility. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but I think it's definitely, there's less of an appetite for that. And if you look at things like trusteeship, that's an area where we have seen particularly small rural organisations really struggling and not being able to do that kind of succession planning, which allows them to continue to be sustainable in the longer term. So I think there is a challenge there in some of those roles that do carry more responsibility, and thinking about how you can be creative about that, maybe sharing things around and not expecting everything to land on one person.
We're finding exactly the same with regards to trustee roles, especially around the young volunteers. And that's what I think organisations do need. They need that change to bring in a little bit of a more younger approach. But a lot of trustee roles, which are volunteering roles, are more like job applications. They're not necessarily, what we are seeing is they're not necessarily seeing on our volunteer opportunity portal, but they're being put on a job site. So again, it's working with organisations to sort of get that understanding of trustees and what the requirements are and if there's any flexibility in that.
And also, the other thing to consider there is whether or not it's possible to look at how people can build experience in those roles rather than using experience as a barrier to those roles. I mean, obviously being a trustee is something that's an important thing for a charity. You do need skill set. But there are ways. We've got a boardroom apprentice scheme in Northern Ireland that works really nicely, that allows people to kind of have the experience of being on a board as an apprentice and trying that out before they can kind of take that full step. And I think there, we do need to be more creative in thinking about ways of getting young people perhaps matched in to learn about how a board works, while also accepting that they're bringing a whole raft of new skills and new experiences that boards may not even have realised they didn't have. So I think there's good opportunities, but we do need to be more deliberate about that.
And Denise, what does this changing picture then mean in terms of how charities should recruit and retain their own volunteers?
Well, I suppose Volunteers Week's a brilliant opportunity to say thank you and to celebrate the volunteers that you have. It's really important, and not just during the week, but all throughout the year, to make sure that volunteers are having a good experience and that the people that are with you already are continuing to stay, because retention is key. Actually, you could do a lot when you've got a core group. You can build on that. It's much more difficult if you've got nothing at all there and you've lost a whole range of volunteers. So I think retention, really, really important, and celebration of thanks, really important. In terms of recruitment, there are new people coming forward, but I think it is about organisations being prepared that might not look and feel the same as the group that they already have, and looking at how those different types of people can be integrated into a wider volunteer pool. It's about wanting to try new things, targeting specific groups, taking risks and taking opportunities. But it's back to that point I made earlier, that the skill set to do that and having volunteer management skills in your organisation is key to making this work.
And Margaret, what's your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is about, ensuring that volunteers are recognised and celebrated throughout the year. They understand the contribution that they're making, which I really think helps to retain volunteers. I know certainly from Scotland that the word retain isn't always, well used, and it's very much seen as a bit of an older term. I think the word retain has led to a sort of stifled approach, or, a bit like putting volunteers in a box, so to speak. Again, through our recruitment campaign, we had put in, recruit, retain, inspire is one of the three key words. We've changed retain to support.
Okay.
Again, just to make it that little bit more fluid, I guess, and a little bit more, again, go back to the word flexible. But it's important, as Denise has said, it's far more important for an organisation to have a volunteer that has been there, established, and that then can help support new other volunteers that are coming in as well and passing on those experiences. So again, this is why we are completely supportive of Volunteers Week as well. Although, as Denise has said as well, it's not just about celebrating volunteers within that week. It's, they should be celebrating volunteers throughout the year as well.
So we opened this discussion on quite a gloomy note, and we must, of course, acknowledge how challenging it currently is at the moment in the volunteering world. But I wondered if either of you had any positive or encouraging signs that you could share in terms of what's to come for volunteering.
We have just published a piece of research with Volunteer Ireland in partnership with Dublin City University and Queen's University Belfast, which was looking at inclusion in volunteering. So you can access that report through our website. It's very encouraging, I think, to see organisations thinking about how they can be more inclusive in their practice. So the research looked at organisations across the island of Ireland who have built an inclusive volunteering population and looked to draw learning from what they've done. And so there are some lovely stories and really inspiring activities in there. I suppose the key thing is back to that word about inspiring people to take part through thinking about altruism, thinking about all the positives of volunteering. So that sort of draw factor in getting people to step forward. But then also the organisational practice around flexibility, around trying to remove recruitment barriers, targeting specific groups and building local partnerships. And then that kind of key thing about internal processes and attitudes within the organisation that really enable people to come and embed and be part of the organisation. But that those organisations are seeing huge benefits in terms of the variety of perspectives and making sure that they can continue to sustain their service into the longer term. So that kind of more inclusive approach, I think, is a spark of real light in the middle of the situation at the moment, and it's lovely to be able to report that that's happening across the island of Ireland as well.
Thanks, Denise. And Margaret, any glimmers of hope for you?
Yeah, this is what we're trying to achieve through the recruitment campaign. We're working with various different size organisations. We are in contact with organisations. I'll give an example, a small charity in Edinburgh that have actually increased their volunteer participation by 200%. So it's not all doom and gloom. What we are doing is working with those organisations that have established good practice and finding out, it's not about reinventing the wheel. There are organisations out there that are doing really well and are successful. The stats that we have are a data set. So there are other organisations and charities, all different sizes, that this data set doesn't always reach. So we're making sure that we're working with those organisations to find out what is working and what is good practice. So it is very positive that it's, things are working and that we're able to learn from others and hopefully pass that on through toolkits, resources, training, looking at proper qualifications and really establishing volunteer management and volunteering is, it is a profession.
Denise, Margaret, thank you both so much for joining us today. It's been really great to hear both your perspectives.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Margaret and Denise. And now we move on to Charity Changed My Life, in which we bring you the stories of people whose lives have been transformed for the better thanks to the work of charities. And this week, we hear from Kyle McIntosh, who received invaluable support from the Longford Trust, which runs a scholarship programme and employability project to help young people rebuild their lives after serving a prison sentence.
I am a software developer, mathematician and ex-prisoner. Take those in whatever order you would like to. In 2019, I was in jail, sat there one night reading the Inside Times, come across an article from the Longford Trust. At that point in time, I was considering what my options were for when I was going to get out of jail, what I was going to do, what was the plan. Fast forward 9 months, I made it to an open jail. On my first day release, I rang the Longford Trust. Education was something which I've always been interested in before I went to jail. Got GCSEs, got A-levels, but kind of fell out of touch with education. So filled out the application for the Longford Trust and actually got a response within a month that I'd been accepted to be a Longford Scholar. The Longford Trust stands for Levelling the Playing Fields by providing support to all Longford Scholars through mentoring, employability, financial support, disclosure and networking. I started my course, mathematics degree, I'd already been introduced to my mentor, Myra, who at that time was helping me kind of getting back to actually being in education, pushing confidence back into me and pushing that belief. Being in jail is kind of like having a cloud over your head, what reigns over you. So you get used to being told that you're worthless, you're nothing, you're just another inmate, you get given a number. It's a massive challenge to drop that when you come out of jail and realise that the world isn't judging you, it's just a mistake what you've made. While being at uni in my second year, I was going to several workshops put on from the Longford Trust and also an employability scheme where we met up with an employer. I was doing the employability workshop with a guy called Rupert Morrison. He's like a tech entrepreneur, great guy. And what led from that is I actually got offered a job at his company. From making all the right decisions, from starting my internship at Arahi, which then led to a full-time role, has enabled me to purchase my own house. I do a lot of traveling around the world, so my life has got back to normality, or a good version of what I'm really happy with, which I consider normality. The joy I get from my family and all the people who supported me while I was in jail, see me now live my life to the best and, continue to work and not get complacent. Without the Longford Trust, I wouldn't be in the situation I'm in. That is 100% fact. I would not be where I am today without the Longford Trust.
That was Kyle talking about the support he received from the Longford Trust. If you'd like your organisation to be featured in Charity Changed My Life, we'd love to hear from you. All it takes is a short message from someone who has benefited from your services, and you can find details of how to get in touch in the show notes to this episode.
And that's it for this week. We'll be continuing the volunteering theme next week with a discussion about skilled volunteers. But for now, thank you to our guests Margaret Starkie and Denise Hayward, and our producer Nav Pal.